Welcome to Coffee to Go, where we center ourselves in the scriptures, seasons, and holy days of the Christian tradition. I'm Karin Peter, here with Blake Smith, and we welcome you on the journey. We are in ordinary time, or the season after Pentecost, where there are a series of numbered or ordered, which is where ordinary comes from. These are numbered Sundays, and there's a long stretch of them in ordinary time from Pentecost until the new year begins with Advent. So we're in September at this point, and we're entering into the last part of ordinary time as we move towards harvest festivals in the Northern Hemisphere and the planting season in the Southern Hemisphere. So it is in this period of time after Pentecost where the church is sent to go and live the ministry and message of Jesus. So this week, where are we with Jesus? Well, we're going to talk about money, or at least Jesus is, and we'll overhear what's being said.
Conversations about money might be popular, except when it comes to Jesus and money. Then it starts getting a little
never works out well.
It comes from the 16th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, and it is the 1st through the 13th verse. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. And he said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into their eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." So why does this matter? Talking about money always matters because we care so much about accumulating wealth. But the question we have to ask ourselves here is that what this scripture is really about? Yes and no would be my answer, because the parable tells how an unscrupulous manager doctored the books to keep his job. He acted shrewdly. That's the words that the passage use. And commentators have debated long and hard about what exactly Jesus is praising here. Because on the surface, it looks like Jesus is praising the shrewdness of the manager and dishonesty and accumulating wealth and setting up for the future, especially in his attempt to make friends and secure his future. But this runs counter to everything else Jesus says about preparing for the future, if we really think about it. So just in the Gospel of Luke, I can think of 3 quick examples. He advised the rich young ruler to sell all of his possessions and give money to the poor. He told his disciples not to worry about their lives, what they will eat or drink or wear. And he chastised a man for building bigger barns to store his possessions. We just talked about that a few weeks ago. So he's obviously, and I say obviously, maybe I should put that in air quotes because obvious to me that he's not praising financial planning here, at least not for the sake of self. And that's kind of an important piece. It's not about preparing financially for the sake of self. He actually warns that money can easily become your master. And just in case you're wondering, that's not a good thing in Jesus' eyes.
I think, Blake, when I was listening to you read it and then begin to unpack it a little bit, it's almost as if let's look at that parable again. And if we were to take away the shrewdly part and the dishonest, honest piece of that, what's left is here we are going through our daily life, doing whatever we need to do in our daily life. And all of a sudden we're hit with the reality of the future. In this case, the manager wouldn't have a job. So if we parallel that with, here's our earthly life, and we're doing what we do in our earthly life, at some point, it's like, wait a minute, am I doing the things I need to do for my own future, not just mine, my community, the world, creation? Am I actually looking at what needs to happen for that desired outcome of God in the world? If I was Baptist, I could say, am I doing enough good works so that am I being good enough so that I can go to heaven when I die? Let's put it that way. That's not what's happening here. But we do in Community of Christ talk about what we do here is for God's purposes here on earth and what is to come. And I think that's what you get when you strip the money and the comment about shrewdness out of this parable. At least that's how it sounded when you read it today. It'll sound different tomorrow.
Probably so. But I think you're right there, Karin. I think that, and one of the commentators actually said, are you using your skills for kingdom purposes?
Yeah.
So I think that that's a really important piece. So it's not about financial planning. It's not about dishonesty. Most likely, the way I would read that, Jesus' words in context of all of his other sayings throughout even just the Gospel of Luke, is I would take that as pretty sarcastic. That, yeah, just don't worry about anybody else. Just go set up your future and prepare a place in heaven and, that kind of thing. And unfortunately, that's not an uncommon belief of a lot of Christian traditions. And so we really want to call that out. And I really believe that that's sarcasm, that what we're really, if there's any good to what this manager has done, is that he has creatively problem solved using his giftedness for, in this case, his purposes. So it's the creative problem solving that's good. Now, how do we take that and turn it around for kingdom purposes, for serving others? That is, for me, the lesson out of this. Yeah. So some questions that we might ask ourselves, given that, are what values do I use when dealing with money? And we might need to consider, where did we learn those values from? Do we need to evaluate those values? Are they the values of the peaceable kingdom? Are they kingdom values, as that commentator said? Do I view financial success as a blessing from God? And this really kind of opens up another can of worms. But, and Karin, you might want to say something on that. I know we've talked about blessings, what we consider blessings sometimes, especially financial blessings, and say,
yeah, you hear people sometimes, you visit and you say, oh, you have a lovely home. And they go, oh, yes, we've been so blessed. And it's like, well, yeah, you had a good education, you have a good job, and you've worked really hard to build a beautiful home. But I'm pretty sure God didn't give that to you because you're so special. I mean, if God's going to bless people, I think there are other people in other parts of the world that probably are in need of God's blessing way more than do you or I need a bigger house.
Yeah. I mean, I think about my own circumstance and having been in a family and we were by no means wealthy, but I've also been reminded many times in life that we were not poor either. We were we were broke from time to time. But ultimately, when it got to my time in life to buy a house, I didn't come with unsurmountable debt because my family had worked hard. My dad had a good job. My mom had a good job. They were married. We had a good, solid foundation in our home, so we weren't working against the odds from the beginning. And a lot of people don't have that. That does not mean that God doesn't choose to bless them as well, or that my privilege and all that goes with that didn't set me up for that in some ways that other people don't have that privilege or honor. So that leaves with a final question.
Ooh, I'm going to make sure Blake goes to college. No, I don't think that's what happens.
I completely agree.
So let's talk about blessing in the way what blessing really is that we participate in God's blessings in the world, both receiving and giving, right? When we interact in community.
Absolutely. And I think a way to look at that for us, honestly, when we're considering that the other being our blessing, having money or having wealth or having a home or having the car that we've always wanted, whatever is, would God really use money as a divine blessing? What other things in our lives might be actual blessings? Yeah. That's where we need to spend some time thinking.
Well, we're going to think about it in maybe how we can bless others this week in a spiritual practice. And I was so pleased that I could make this work for a Sunday because I've been wanting to use this. So for a time, the presiding bishopric had these banks, these cardboard banks that kids could get.
I remember that.
Divided in 3 parts. And the first part was the 10% that you donate either to your congregation or world church or to a charity. And then 10% you saved. So you put your 10% of whatever your income was in that part of the bank. And then the 80% you spent responsibly. So your living expenses, that kind of thing. And they were just such a wonderful tool. And a lot of people just didn't know about them because they weren't like heavily PR'd or anything, but they were just one of the best tools for helping young people and old people for that matter, kind of navigate through what does it mean to use what does bless my life, regardless of how it ended up coming to me. How do I use that responsibly as a disciple? So this week, gather up paper and pen or pull up the calculator app on your phone, if you're like me, and do what you need to do to kind of figure out what your weekly income is. So now, each night, light a candle, center yourself, and then decide the first night where you're going to give that 10% of your giving money. Do you participate in a congregation? Do you want to give it there? Do you want to send it for world mission? Do you want to send it to outreach? What do you want to do with that money? And then you put your 10% you're going to save, and then you have that 80% left that's your living expenses. So here's the spiritual practice part. You're actually looking at each day, how am I going to spend this day's part of that 80%? What does that look like? And then you reflect on that, how that 10-10-80 affects your daily spending and your daily practices and your relationship with money.
That's an interesting way to look at it. You always think about it in terms of a month at a time or even maybe annually, but to break it down in a day to day, I like that. I look forward to trying that.
Well, and it's easier to do once you've, paid your monthly bills and you have what you're going to live on for the rest of the month. And I think that's a really good time to do the 10-10-80 because that's the money that you would have access to as you spend during the week. At least it does in my world. So yeah, this involves math. So it won't be my best spiritual practice for the week, but I am going to give it a shot.
All right. Well, there's probably an app, like you said, that will help you.
Yes.
It's not just a calculator. There's probably even an app that will do it other ways. Our blessing today, speaking of blessings and other blessings, let's talk about some blessings. Let's have a blessing that looks at blessings other than money. And this one is called Thanksgiving, and it's by Claudio Carvalles. For tears, water of life that runs down our faces and connects our lives. For the burden of God's creation. For the spirit of solidarity. For when we are welcomed. And for the hospitality of indigent people, for God's goodness running through the natural resources, for the ability to listen to wounded people, for the chance to become better humans, for the activists, community workers, and prophets who give their lives, gifts, and labor to the people of the world, for being together here, for the noise of children, for the spirit of resistance and rebellious people, for clean water, the strength and courage to live on in spite of loss, for hope that comes from smiles and laughter, and for faith and patience in the midst of suffering. Well, thanks for joining us here again today at Coffee to Go. We invite you to join us next time for the next part of our journey through the liturgical seasons and holy days of the Christian tradition.
Welcome to Coffee to Go, where we center ourselves in the scriptures, seasons, and holy days of the Christian tradition. I'm Karin Peter, here with Blake Smith, and we welcome you on the journey. We are in ordinary time in the liturgical year, often called the season after Pentecost. And this is a series of numbered or ordered Sundays that take place between Pentecost and the end of the liturgical year and the beginning of Advent. And we are in the later part of ordinary time as we move toward harvest festivals in the Northern Hemisphere and the planting seasons in the Southern Hemisphere. And it's in this period of time after Pentecost where the church is sent to go and live the ministry and message of Jesus. So, where's Jesus this week? Well, he's hanging out teaching, and we are eavesdropping, and we are in the company of the Pharisees because they are eavesdropping as Jesus does some teaching, and Jesus is pretty aware that they are over there around the corner. I can just see them peeping around a corner or peeping around a pillar, eavesdropping on Jesus. And since they're already within the sound of his voice, he tells a parable and lets them, as Dale Luffman used to say, overhear the message.
Yeah, I get this image of having like a ram's horn or something, that goes around the corner that they've got in their ear, listening as if Jesus wouldn't know. All right, well, our scripture today comes from the 16th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, and it is the 19th through the 31st verse. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good tidings, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." He said, "Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." He said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." Wow. Oh. Hear ye, oh, you congregations that believe.
This is hard as disciples because we're like, every single one of us passes a homeless person somewhere in our travels. We all know situations happening in the country today where bad stuff is happening. And this is an interesting scripture to have as our lectionary text in the middle of this. So tell us why it matters, Blake.
Yes, it is. I mean, Jesus is definitely making a point here. And as he said through many other passages throughout the Gospels, you can't take it with you. Yeah. So the riches that you hoard for you and yours won't cut it when you die. Luke's offering here a story of caution when it comes to wealth and social privilege. If you hoard it, won't do anything or for you in the future. And it won't alleviate the sufferings of others if you're hoarding it. So, you may say, well, you can't take it with you. We might say in our congregations, well, we need to preserve this resource that we have. Well, if the congregation closes and the money's sitting there, it won't do anybody any good. That's not to say go out and spend frivolously. Please don't hear that. But putting our priorities in line is important. There are a couple of things here that really stand out for me too in the passage. I mean, there's a couple of things. First of all, that last line is a really confrontational piece that ought to hit all of us as we think about that. But two particular things about this passage. I don't know if you notice, but when they're describing the characters in the parable, the wealthy man is unnamed.
Right.
And the poor man is named. And we've talked about before, when you give name to something, you give power to something. And so the preference for the poor and the oppressed, I mean, this person is honored, Lazarus. It's not the Lazarus that we know in the other stories as Jesus' friend. This is the beggar at the gate of this wealthy man who is defined more by his clothing and his possessions than by his name. And the second thing is, and I've read this passage, I don't know how many times, I've never caught this, but I was reading in one of the commentaries and it just really caught my attention. And that is that even after death, this wealthy man from Hades is calling out demands. He's making demands, and he expects Lazarus to do his bidding for him. Send Lazarus to put his finger in the cool water and put it on the tip of my tongue. Send Lazarus to save my brothers. I mean, he still has that, feels like he has that position of privilege and power, even after the judgment has been exacted. One other commentary said, this is just a little extra piece, is that probably when you think about the funerals of the two, I'm sure that there was, had this been not just a parable, but a real thing, that this rich man would have had this absolutely extravagant funeral with all the mourners gathered, and saying all this praise about him, only for him to go to Hades. And then the named but poor beggar is carried off without pomp or circumstance or grand funeral, but living in the presence of God. So just some interesting pieces in that parable that make me think, I should say.
I also think it's really important that we look at that last verse, that if they're not going to believe Moses and the prophets, they're not going to believe someone from the dead. And when they talk about that, about not heeding the words of the prophets, that's actually a pretty political message, because the prophets that they're speaking of, Moses and the prophets, spoke outside of political power and outside of social power. These weren't the palace prophets that are being referred to here that spoke what the king would want to hear. There were lots of those. We can point to instances of that, especially in the Old Testament. But here, basically, the prophets that are being referred to are the ones that would say, care for the widows and the orphans. People, listen, it's not going to go good for you, Israel. You're not caring for the widows and the orphans. And that happens how many times when you read through the prophets? More than I can even think of at the moment. And yet they are still not heeded in this parable. What's Jesus trying to say? What does he want the Pharisees to overhear?
There's good reason why we hear that a prophet is not accepted in their own hometown, because a true prophet is not just speaking the words that make you feel good. They're speaking the words of God, which are warning against complete disregard for the poor and the oppressed and those who are marginalized. And so if it was political then, It is certainly a political conversation now. I think one of the things that I try to bring into conversation when people start saying, well, that's political, we can't talk about it, is before it was political, it was a gospel issue. Before it was a political issue, it was a gospel issue. And it's what we're called to. And so I think sometimes, and I see it happening a lot in our current context, where we politicize things in some effort, maybe consciously, maybe subconsciously, to keep the church out of it. Well, we can't talk about that because it's politics. But Jesus and the prophets were all about speaking truth to power. And so when we look at issues now of diversity, equity, and inclusion that have become associated with woke, which is being pushed as a bad thing to be, which actually just means being aware of reality, being aware of the truth of our past, of our present. So when we're talking about immigrants and undocumented and unwanted and trans and people of color and the poor and the sick, these are the people that Jesus was concerned about. And as such, they are the people that we as disciples ought to also be concerned about. Because it's a radical God who cares about the oppressed and the downtrodden. And we're faced with the question of how radical are we willing to be? Are we willing to be those prophets who speak against the current structures, be they political or religious or cultural? I mean,
if they're demeaning and demoralizing people, then those
right.
are not Christian policies to get behind. Yeah, it's really tough to even have the conversation now. So I want to clarify, we're not talking about partisan politics here.
No.
We're talking about the political implications of what it really means to speak truth to power. And those are very different things. So we just want to make that clear here.
Yeah, thanks for that, Karin. So some questions we might ask ourselves are, in what ways have I been the rich man or woman, the rich character in this story? When have I made the welfare of someone else my priority? And as I already mentioned, how radical am I willing to be?
We might want to add one more. When have I been peeking around the pillar, overhearing what Jesus has to say, and yet not acting on it? Tough ones this week. So how can we experience this? We talked last week about the 80-10-10 with our money, donating 10%, saving 10%, and then using the 80% to spend responsibly. So I think that 10% comes into play, our donating part, and that is use some dollars, use some of your financial resources this week to alleviate the suffering of others. So whether it's donating to Outreach International or Red Cross or Planned Parenthood or whatever it is that you feel will alleviate the suffering of others where you live, put your dollars to work to do some of that this week.
I want to add one more question to that as I think about that. We talked about that last statement, the last verse. So my question would be, if I'm not willing to listen to Moses and the prophets, what will it take to convince me?
Yeah. We could say that in our own denomination. If I'm not willing to listen to sections 164 and 165 that talk about the critical situation of the environment and earth, what is it going to take to convince me?
Yeah, absolutely. So our blessing today comes from Kate Bowler for loving someone when differences divide us. God, this is a hard one. How do I begin to love or even connect with someone so different from me? How do I bridge this gap? It feels just as wrong as the beliefs I abhor. Blessed are we who want to be a part of the wild and beautiful experiment to find a common humanity. Who desires to come willingly into the gap that separates human from human, to love the stranger, especially the one we really don't understand and secretly want to set straight? Blessed are we, willing to stay in the gap, in the contradictions of what we can't understand, to actively work on disproving our own intuitions about another in order to begin to see what they see. Blessed are we, swimming upstream against the current of our own human frailty, our fears and emotions, and willing to be wrong for a second, to reconsider, and to hold to our integrity with kindness, desiring to see the lay of the land and play the course instead of the one we wished it could be, and to discover that humility is what makes change possible. Grace is never neutral. It works backwards and forwards in time, conspiring to make wrong right. Amen. Well, thanks for joining us here again today at Coffee to Go. We invite you to join us next time for the next part of our journey through the liturgical seasons and holy days of the Christian tradition.